We're starting now. This is the vegan anarchist. And this Earth Day special, we're going to talk about environmental stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Introduce yourself, Bobby and Pedro.
Hello, Bobby, aka Eco-Anarchism here, and I look forward to this live stream.
And I am Pedro McCaskill, also known. I'm Bob. Sorry, I'm Bob. I'm Pedro McCaskill. I don't really have a channel yet, but I'm working on one. Yeah, today I'm planning on talking about like bioregionalism and green anarchism.
Anyways, let's just start off with the whole green anarchist critique of capitalism and brown anarchism and brown socialism, to use the term. Likes to talk about the infinite growth on a finite planet leads to environmental disaster.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Bobby should just have the floor on that. So,
Okay,
stuff.
yeah, like, like, capitalism basically creates a culture in which, in which growth is done for the sake of growth, and this naturally leads to an unsustainable ecological framework, and it essentially creates a waste culture in which in in which everything is too expensive, and everything is disposable. Every like when everything is easily available, including every including things you don't even really need, then nothing really makes much of an impact on your life. It's just you get more and more and more, and you're never really satisfied, and you're just basically trying to fill that hole inside yourself, and you never can, because there are all these other factors you're overlooking because you're focused almost exclusively on your material needs and desires. And so you you neglect spirituality, you neglect your need. I mean, I'm not religious, obviously, but I am nonetheless, like, when I use the term spirituality, I mean basically just caring for other people, and 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 developing relationships, because that to me is what spirituality is really supposed to be about. I don't think of it in terms of dogma, or
Ooh.
woo, or pseudoscience, or gods, or any of that shit. I I think of it strictly as a relationship focused search for truth.
It kind of leads us to the discussion because Bobby brought up like consumerism and the idea that in order to be happy, you have to be like a hoarder in many ways. Get the best jewelry, get the best car, get the best this, get the best that. But at the end of the day, does that stuff really matters? Why are people? The capitalism has brainwashed people into thinking diamonds, which is just a chunk of rock that's very common, is worth something other than as like a tool you use to cut things with. And we have to change the way capitalism works, and by abolishing capitalism, we also need to reverse the consumerism, otherwise we risk the whole brown Soviet socialist model, which destroys the environment. And ultimately, though, we're going to have to focus less on like consuming things and more on like harvesting, like being in a relationship with other people and yourself, and self-actualization, not materialism.
Right.
Yeah, and also in capitalism, you have, of course, a lot of industries taking advantage of planned obsolescence, where they're purposefully making fragile and easily breakable products so that they can get more returning profits and recurring purchases. And so you have very poorly made technology that took a lot of capital to be able to create in the first place, just kind of disposed all over the place and nothing really to do with it. And it's not being taken advantage of in any way that's even remotely close to useful. Not to mention how frequently we throw out food in the Western world.
Yeah. Precisely. And the way that value is perceived in the West in general, like where basically we have this misconception that everything that has a high price is automatically more valuable, when clearly that isn't the case, because there are a lot of products that are absolutely shitty and worthless that have high prices.
And a related issue, like for example, capitalism is so bad at counting externalities that I've heard somewhere, don't quote me on this, but it's probably like an example, like when you consider the externalities of something like a cheeseburger, you get like Walmart, or I know it's a non-vegan example, but bear with me, or like Burger King. If you count externalities, the price should be at least $200. Poor people cannot afford the $200, and those also the same poor people who are hurt by the consequences of the product. So either way, they're gonna pay a shit ton. Because poor people, also people tend to be people of color, and both of them tend to experience lots of environmental racism. Anyways, you guys want to comment on that or expand on it?
Yeah, I mean, oh, yeah, a lot of, oh, a lot of, times, there's this, like I said, this perception that price and cost and value are equivalent, but clearly that is not the case, because many many things in capitalist countries cost far more than they actually would be worth by a more objective metric. And now, obviously, I, as a postmodernist, have my problems with the concept of objectivity. However, like I'm saying that if things were more objective, then it would not be just a matter of how much they cost.
Pedro?
Well,
I don't know what's
oh, sorry. We had brought up environmental racism earlier, and I would like to kind of comment on that a little bit. When it comes to capitalist industrial expansionism, you have the fact that a lot of the time when they are worried about the effects of pollution on society, they're only worried about the effects of pollution upon like upper class communities, upper class predominantly white communities. And so you don't see anything near to the same extent in like poorer like POC communities. And so I lived in Philadelphia for a long time, and during my time living there, we had something very similarly as what happened while what was going on in Flint, Michigan, um, where we had a lot of city workers having to do a complete overhaul of the entire city's water system. The predominantly poorer, predominantly black parts of West Philadelphia were having terrible, terrible water issues to the point where when I turned on my faucet, smelly brown water came out for weeks at a time. And it even when you weren't using the water at all, you could smell it at all times of the day. It permeated not just our house or our apartment complex, but the entire community that we lived in. And I mean, similarly, you see in like Native American and Indigenous communities how like kind of rural like gas power and like rural kind of coal power and fossil fuel developments will almost always choose to deflect any potential pollution away from heavily populated wealthy areas and towards more rural areas, especially Native American reservations or Chicano communities, or it just kind of any rural non-white community that they know that they will have a tacit approval to basically walk all over, and that there wouldn't be any kind of big money to fight them back on that.
As someone who was lucky enough not to experience like brown smelly water that in some places can actually be lit on fire, I have no idea how the hell someone would even handle living in that situation, how they would take a shower, how they would do laundry or drink or any of that stuff. Can you provide how like people actually live under those conditions?
Well, I can tell you about it. In my personal experience. Some people would spend money to get at the time it was the summertime, and so people would get water for pretty cheap from really discount value stores like Family Dollar or Dollar Tree or something like that, where they could get bulk water for cheap, and then they would sometimes use that for cooking and for showering and for bathing, which is pretty ridiculous that in the 21st century in one of the top 5 most populated cities in the country we had to do something like that. But that's just how, I guess, the name of the game, you know. At other times though, there were plenty of people who just they didn't have the time, and so they would just bathe in that water. They would use that water to cook because they didn't really have any other choice. This is especially kind of compounded upon even worse when you have to deal with the fact that in Philadelphia there's like a really significant amount of the city that is like a significant amount of the buildings that are abandoned, and so there's no accountability to the utilities for the city to those buildings, and so you either have homeless people squatting in those buildings, or you have slumlords renting out those buildings privately for a much higher price and basically getting free utilities, but still charging utilities and rent to their tenants. You combine all of these problems and you get an almost impossible situation. Workers having to go on a building by building basis to find out whether or not there's actually people in the building, whether or not they're going to get into a massive legal battle, whether or not they're going to have to like legally evict people that are living in a slumlord's place, and it's just a massive, massive waste of energy and resources.
And who's making the money when poor people have to buy water?
Who's making the money when poor people have to buy water? The corner stores, convenience stores, places like that. I mean, when you're living in communities that are that poor, most people can't really afford to go to like big chain stores unless the chain stores are offering very low prices. Sometimes they'll just have to kind of go to the local corner store just to be able to buy food, water, that kind of thing. I mean, that's been the majority of my experience, at least, living in both, like living all over, like kind of very poor, downtown, not downtown, but poor, like city areas in the Mid-Atlantic.
And the quality of the products in those stores are typically less, and actually the poor people who buy from those stores actually end up paying more over the long term. At least that's what I heard in sociology class. I don't know if Pedro or Bobby knows anything about that. Poor people pay more for the same things that rich or middle class people do.
I've heard about that pretty extensively, but I don't really want to comment on it until I know more for sure. What I can tell you, though, is that almost unanimously, most of those stores, with the possible exception of,
I mean, pretty much everybody in this hangout is poor, so
yeah.
I
Basically,
mean, like I used to be I mean, I used to be like upper middle class before my family used to be upper middle class before the recession, but after the recession of 08 hit, we became lower middle class to working class.
I went kind of to the same boat, and I went from basically upper middle class living in a mansion until like basically kind of lower middle class at best, working class kind of ish place. And often I have to sometimes I'll have to like rely on the government benefits. You just make it sometimes.
yeah.
And my dad and my mom divorced, so that left me more of a chance to actually qualify for welfare that I wouldn't otherwise would have.
And the other thing is that a lot of the businesses that provide the materials for a lot of, like, for extremely cheap products are overwhelmingly people that are doing like, mass factory kind of wage slavery throughout tons of areas in the global south, or in extremely poor rural parts of the United States, and paying their workers next to nothing. So so that even further compounds a lot of those kinds of problems. I mean, especially when you get into how like, obviously we could talk about basically the impact of mass industrialization has had on the PRC.
Let's go on that next. Yeah.
So as a result of the fact that most of the impoverished people in the United States can't really be ethical consumers, can't really investigate the quality and the effort that goes into every single product that they have to buy on a daily basis. For most people, they just buy the cheapest thing that's the closest to where they live. So um, a lot of the places that provide these extremely cheap products are places that are overwhelmingly kind of like almost, if not outright, slave labor in parts of the global south, especially in East Asia and South Asia, Southeast Asia, and parts of like Oceania. And so, um, because we've exported our production there because it's cheaper, you have kind of this mass industrialism taking extremely devastating tolls on the environment over there. And so everybody knows about, the people in the PRC having to wear like surgical masks on a daily basis because of the pollution in the cities is so bad. But what they don't really know about is how, because we're basically shipping from like poorer countries to more developed, quote unquote, first world countries, we have an almost never ending stream of like container barges going through the Pacific Ocean that are causing extreme devastation to the ocean's ecosystem. So some pretty decent examples would be the Barrier Reef, or how a lot of the time you'll have like container spills, not just for stuff like oil, but just for average everyday products where sometimes due to like kind of a lack of regulation in one kind of or another, you'll have ships basically spilling product all throughout the ocean, or the ships are so gigantic that they're literally like carving like their tracks through the ocean's ecosystem. And so that's an extremely devastating part of that a lot of people don't really notice because it's not as visual as, smokestacks with gray clouds, darkening the entire sky.
That's, man, Pedro, you added a lot to the conversation. It funny thing is that we have 14 dislikes and only 2 likes.
Oh wow! Okay.
Anyways, can just go on with the usual. And one of those likes was me, of course. But yeah,
I wonder where they could be from.
someone in the comment section says someone here looks like an aborted fetus.
All right. Well, we don't. That's just ableism. We don't really need to give them any platform.
Yeah. Anyways, how is degrowth could possibly help mend the situation of pollution, especially when it affects like non-human animals and people of color and people who are poor and working class anyways?
I think it would be so. Part of degrowth is you have kind of more communal, kind of more small scale societies, and so if you had smaller sustainable societies, you wouldn't theoretically need to be getting as much production from other parts of the world, especially if without a private property kind of infrastructure, people would be able to share kind of common tools that they would normally use. So you wouldn't have as much kind of excess. You wouldn't have to have an entire community of people all owning their own private lawnmower when they don't use it, almost, for the great majority of the time. And you could have people instead just, using kind of like communal utilities. And you would only need more if there was conflicts over um, kind of too many people using it at the same time. And so that itself would cut down a lot on, kind of to get back to an earlier point, like excess materialism. and the whole like keeping up with the Joneses mentality. Also, from an anarchist perspective, having like more smaller scale, more self-sustainable communities brings the kind of political locus of control back to the people living in the communities themselves, rather than kind of an external central like federal power or some kind of state apparatus or state institution that has to come in and then have to like either learn the context of the local culture or just very rigidly implement whatever their agenda is, regardless of circumstances. Similarly, there's also the like total liberation movement, which kind of ties in a bit to veganarchism, which talks about having like kind of like a very unified approach against all forms of oppression, be it environmental oppression, ableism, speciesism, environmental devastation, sexism, cissexism, racism, capitalism, the whole 9 yards. And so if you could have a unified political front in that kind of vein that was kind of voluntarily tackling, or not voluntarily, but like freely associatingly tackling all these problems, then I think that would lead to much more kind of beneficial like outcomes, and it would be a lot easier to resist or to mount resistance against kind of large scale political institutions. And of course, with that, you have more of a sense of freedom and equality, again, being focused on local communities.
I'm glad you mentioned the whole veganarchist movement and the whole total liberation. That's pretty much my channel's about, and various others channels who are either anarchists or closed, like Mexi, a privileged vegan, Rich Flowers. Let's talk about resistance option, and I know Pedro wanted to talk about what is green insurrectionism.
So there's been a history throughout, especially the later parts of the 20th century, of insurrectionary green actions, whether it be kind of independent journalism into factory farming, or whether it be or whether it be various other kinds of revolutionary green tactics. Like there's the where you have kind of people standing in the way of industrial bulldozing or clear cutting the forests, or people basically directly using their bodies as a front line of resistance against either private or state organizations that want to set up their own be it like fossil fuel plant or devastate the local ecosystem to create like a sprawling suburban like residential complex or a golf course, stuff like that. And so there's been a very long-standing history of those kinds of movements. And what people often fail to point to is the fact that these movements have direct correlations with racial movements as well, especially First Nations people and the indigenous resistance movements, which have a very, very real and personal history with mass capitalist and state expansion onto their own sovereignty. And so it's not only that, it kind of also ties into something else I wanted to talk about, which is the bioregional movement, where you'll have kind of local cells of like working class individuals kind of advocating for an independent society that is focused more on the rural culture of the ecosystem that they live in its totality, including the landscape, the wildlife,
Plants and animals.
As well, instead of kind of just an arbitrary like state boundary, or instead of just a biological boundary by species, kind of an environmental boundary itself, which for a lot of communities is more core to their local culture than kind of like a state, kind of like a top-down state culture. Especially because in places like Canada and the United States, you have large, big city pockets that have kind of a level of cultural influence that surrounds into a metropolitan area, but then you have vast swaths of very low populated rural working class areas in between most of these cities that have a local culture either defined by the industries that used to be there, defined by agrarianism, or defined by the long-standing kind of like ecological culture that they've had there from having to survive in that landscape.
Mm-hmm.
Bobby, you look like you want something to say.
Yeah. Also, there's also like there's a big there's a big amount of profit in the in the climate denialism industry, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that that corporations do not want to take responsibility for their role in essentially worsening climate change over the years by promoting the fossil fuel industry and such things of that nature.
Yeah, like the Koch brothers, for example, they're a major contributor to the party. Although Democrats are not are pretty shitty too, but the Koch brothers fund a lot of our opposition, like the Cato Institute, who are a bunch of market fundamentalists.
Oh yeah,
And they have entire communities destroyed because of the greedy pockets that the Koch brothers want to enrich with cash.
Also,
Or at least digital money.
also, there's also a big part of the um the Libertarian Party of the USA's rise to power was also funded by the Koch brothers through something called the Americans for Sound Money. And that was a corporate think tank. So when the Libertarian Party USA claims to be anti-corporatism, they're full of shit because their roots are in corporatism.
Oh, we have a comment. Read the book, The Technological Society by Jacques Ellul. I don't know how to pronounce him. He destroys the technophile progress argument. Yeah, we here are against like technophilia and technophobia, so we just want to critically evaluate every piece of new technology and adopt them rather on what the potential consequences could be.
Right.
How likely they are. Yeah, technophilia, it can be very dangerous if it doesn't.
Yeah. We're to clarify, we are not primitivists. In fact, we are very critical of primitivism in multiple areas, such as their tendency to believe in a lot of pseudoscience, their revisionistic notion of history, their tendency toward social Darwinism, their tendency to support things like eugenics. I just want to get that out of the way. We do not support primitivism.
A lot of us here, I don't know about a lot of us, but I myself identify as post-civ.
Yeah,
So do I, but there's a distinction to be made between post-civ and anti-civ extremism, which a lot of premies engage in.
I know, I just want to point that out. Anyways, Pedro, you're going to say?
we can talk about our criticisms of primitivism as well if we want. I know that was something I wanted to touch upon a little bit today.
I mean, I just basically ran down a list of criticisms, but you can sort of expand on that, Pedro, if you want.
Sure. So, for not only does primitivism kind of take a very socially Darwinistic kind of approach to society at large, but it's also founded upon a lot of essentialist assumptions.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's extremely technophobic to an unrealistic extent.
Exactly.
And it's fundamentally ableist, in my opinion, in that
Oh yeah.
yeah, like without kind of contemporary medical science, there are a lot of people who wouldn't be able to function in that kind of a society, that a primitivist would just say, oh, well, just let them die because it's for the greater good of the earth as a whole, and so that's basically taking the majority of disabled people and a large percentage of neuroatypical people, and just in essence kind of coining them off, pawning them off in favor of this, in my opinion, extremely reactionary, green, utopian, like tribalistic, quote unquote, paradise, which in my opinion sounds extremely traditionalistic and regressive, and it's I find it.
I also like to point out that even low-tech society have been environmentally destructive. Like in many continents, we have wiped out entire species of animals, even with our primitive technology. And also, like, it won't stop civilization from coming back. Like, there are lots of tribes and primitive communities are going through like a minor and agricultural revolution as we speak, or had been going, like the Yarimani or Arimani or whatever tribe they are in Venezuela. I think that's the location. Like, it won't stop different tribes from re-domesticating plants and animals and having this fuckery we call civilization and statism, and now would we have capitalism, which is like the civilization on steroids kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, another example of that would be how the Social Democratic Party in Brazil has basically decided, you know what, let's ease back regulations on the deforestation of the Amazon to the point where if it keeps up at the rate that it's going, about 50% of it will be gone. And think about that for a second, 50% of it, that's gigantic. Because the Amazon stretches all the way from French Guiana all the way down to Uruguay. It's huge.
Right.
It's bigger than most countries. And so, I mean, 10% of the Earth's entire like species diversity is located within the Amazon rainforest. And like in Latin America, there's a long-standing history of indigenous resistance to big businesses, and it kind of ties into, there are aspects of colorism involved. there are aspects of settler colonialism involved, where you have like the more like kind of Europeanized and westernized, like urban populated areas imposing down kind of administrative laws by getting money from foreign companies to sell out local indigenous peoples all over the entire countryside. And this is kind of a hallmark that you'll see in almost every single Latin American country, whether it be Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Chile, Mexico, it happens in Mexico, Guatemala, and I mean the same thing is fundamentally happening in the United States and in Canada. Oh, and not to mention Australia too. So the resistance against industrial devastation of the ecosystem is very closely tied to indigenous resistance movements, and it always has been. It's always been a fundamentally colonialist kind of exploitation that's been going on. I mean, you can look at Africa as a pretty decent example as well, especially the examples you gave with like diamond farming, oil.
Blood diamonds, which is you're included there.
Yeah. And poaching ties into that as well, to the point where I read very recently that there's only one example, or there's only one male, I believe, Ethiopian white rhinoceros. There's only one male rhinoceros still in existence. So that species is more likely than not fundamentally extinct. Not to mention what's happened to the Great Barrier Reef. And the effects of climate change have also been devastating throughout Polynesia and Oceania as well, where you have kind of very old Polynesian native communities and island communities having to completely resettle because there are several islands that have literally sunken underneath the ocean. You know, as a result of climate change and as a result of rising sea levels and like irregular weather patterns. People that have been living there for thousands and thousands of years, people that went through all of the argument they like to bring up would be the medieval ice age. People that went through all of it. People have been living there for thousands of years, and now all of a sudden they have no choice but to move somewhere else. And these kinds of refugee crises only cause further resource wars that further compounds the problems of mass industrial imperialist capitalism. So
yeah, some guy pointed out social democrats, and he put 3 KKK in the middle of Democrats and social democrats, which is pretty funny. Because the indigenous live off the land, that's their life. They can't afford to have the land sold and destroyed.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I mean it's a long-standing reality for indigenous people, and a more modern reality for like rural colonial, like poor working class people in settler countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia, South Africa, places like that. All right. Was there anything you had to say about that? Sorry.
Anything Bobby has to say?
Yeah, I mean, historically, indigenous peoples and environmental struggles have very much gone together, because indigenous peoples then tend to be very strongly affected by environmental degradation and biochemical waste and things of that nature.
Yeah. What do you guys think about the whole social ecology versus deep ecology debate?
I mean, I tend to be very much in favor of social ecology and very critical of deep ecology, but then I'm somewhat biased because a lot of primitivists use deep ecology, and I really do not like primitivism.
What about you, Pedro? Pedro?
Oh,
Pedro?
sorry. I was struggling there with the mute button. My kind of view is kind of similar to Bobby's. I'm more a fan of social ecology. If I had to pick between social ecology and deep ecology, because of its yeah, similarly because of its ties with kind of reactionary, like post-left environmentalist movements. Um, and you know that my economic kind of standpoint on this is kind of a mix between Marxian and eco-sociological or eco-socialist economics and a more kind of communal political infrastructure.
Me personally, I think I would mix deep and social ecology. I know a lot of anarchists hate deep ecology, but deep ecology has been a very big influence on the animal rights movement.
Yeah, it has, and
Mm.
yeah, the movement has had a lot of kind of interaction and overlap with green direct actions, especially in like Canada and in the northwestern United States.
So, would you guys agree that we're radical environmentalists?
Yeah, I could say that. I could definitely call myself a radical environmentalist, and I definitely
Same.
one of my larger problems with the left, especially with the socialist left, is that they kind of like you were saying earlier, advocate a form of brown socialism, brown anarchism, brown communism, where they'll say theoretically, oh yeah, I care about the environment, but they never do they stop and address the actual problems of the environment. Never do they present any actual real concrete solutions to any of those
Yeah,
problems. Nor do they really take them seriously.
and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that um that that um that for some reason Americans in particular, but Westerners in general really tend to have that perception that any sort of environmental action is inherently liberal, even though liberals are actually despite their public um despite their public appeals to environmental concern, one of the most environmentally wasteful political groups on the planet. And so liberals are far from consistent environmentalists. Um, Anarchists and social democrats tend to be more consistent in that respect, with as do communists in general. Um, I mean, not all, obviously, because that's just kind of a general statement, right? Right. Not all of any group or any demographic will support or oppose something 100% of the time.
Someone asked about what about transhumanism?
I mean,
against technophilia and technophobia, as we've said many times.
I
I
used
do
to,
think that transhumanism
I mean,
is good
I
for
used to,
disabled people.
Yeah.
Okay, I used to somewhat flirt with, transhumanism, personally. I, and personally, like, I'm not opposed to using some moderate amount of technology to like replace lost limbs, if a person so chooses, but obviously that can be extremely expensive, and and I'm and I'm very critical of like immortalism, because I I I think that mortality is an essential part of our humanity, and and mortality is also largely what allows us to have empathy for the suffering of others. So yeah.
Western culture is incompatible with anarchism and/or communism. What do you guys think?
Not necessarily, no. I
Necessarily,
mean,
but it definitely stands in opposition to those things most of the time.
And then somebody brought up the Frankfurt School, and somebody pointed out the Frankfurt School rule were anti-progress and did brought somewhat write a little bit about the domination of nature. And do you guys know much about that? If that's true or not?
Well, the Frankfurt School were mostly kind of very Keynesian, kind of center right. So they were more focused upon like a very liberal idea of progress rather than like a fundamental societal idea of progress. And I'm kind of skeptical of the idea of progress, quote unquote, in general. Um, I mean, I don't have too much to say on the Frankfurt School because a lot of the information surrounding the Frankfurt School is shrouded in conspiracy theory, and so I don't like to talk about it too much, with the exception of like the Chicago Boys and stuff like that.
I just like to say I love cultural Marxism.
I will say on the topic of transhumanism, I'm extremely skeptical of immortalism. I'm skeptical of the ecological consequences of transhumanism. I'm skeptical of the socio-cultural and political consequences of transhumanism, especially kind of like transhumanists that seem to kind of fetishize like Kurzweilian singularity and stuff like that. Um, and on top of but I will say, I do think transhumanism can be extremely liberating in like a gender sense and in an ability sense, in that it could provide new avenues for neuroatypical and non-binary people to express their gender and to kind of express new avenues of like their identities. So I think those are possible upsides of transhumanism, though in general, I'm extremely skeptical of it, especially because it's shrouded in like utopian technophilia. So
The Frankfurt School, someone pointed out, was a Marxist, not liberal.
it depends. Okay, so it depends on which specific members of the Frankfurt School we're talking about.
Like Adorno, for example.
Yeah, so okay, so the Frankfurt School is often kind of brought up when people talk about like the global socialist revolution. And so there are definitely Marxian elements to the Frankfurt School, but then there were others that were more about liberalization and like kind of like philosophical enlightenment and those kinds of ideas. So it's not as cut and dry as saying the Frankfurt School was a straight up leftist kind of platform, because it really wasn't. But
yeah.
that's just my.
I mean, like in general, like in general, the like American corporate think tanks and American right-wing politicians have a habit of exaggerating the radicalism of left-wing institutions and individuals compared to what it really is.
Yeah.
I mean, I wish that leftists, especially American leftists, were more radical, but unfortunately they aren't. They just aren't.
American leftists are probably like the least radical and the fewest percentage relative to the population of any industrialized country.
Yeah.
It's sad, but we're basically trying to rebuild what's been lost through the first and second Red Scare of McCarthyism.
Yeah. Though a lot of McCarthyism had more to do with like the political, the politics going behind the scenes rather than just Joe McCarthy himself. Very little of McCarthyism actually had to do with McCarthy himself. Those kind of just the story being told and the culture expressing itself very directly. A majority of what was going on was behind the scenes blacklisting and political a political witch hunt of sorts that was coming from the administration.
Yeah, and also McCarthy sort of become a cult figure over the years, and it's funny because like a lot of rightists today admire McCarthy because he opposed communism, right? And yet he praised Hitler.
Yeah.
Like he praised the Nazi Party because the Nazi Party was suppressing the rights of communists and Jews, and McCarthy was very much a traditionalist Catholic, anti-Semite, racist bigot. And yet, like that fact sort of gets lost historically because people focus exclusively on the anti-communist aspect and how great that's supposed to be, because communism's supposed to be this evil thing in the mind of many Americans, but because they're unable to differentiate between the historical roots of communism and the way quote unquote communism manifested politically through, which wasn't even real communism. And in fact, these dictatorships never claimed to be real communists. They claimed to be moving towards communism through state capitalism, but in reality, they weren't even doing that. They were just doing state capitalism out and out.
Yeah.
Of course, the degree of the state capitalism varied from era to era, but yeah, like that's basically what it was.
Let's talk about the brown socialists and why they're basically brown.
So the brown socialists are kind of overwhelmingly industrial unionists, overwhelmingly kind of entranced into the idea of socialist progress and utopian socialism and a reconstruction from the ground up using like anachronistic models of how society should be reconstructed post-revolution and old school, outdated industrial era and modern era economics. So that the fact that they are so entrapped in such outdated theories is, in my opinion, a lot of why they cannot come to terms with like the new realities of a contemporary, like environmentally sustainable left-wing movement. Especially when you have a lot of like more organizationalist and Marxian leftists basically wagging their finger at radical environmentalists, be them earth liberationists, animal liberationists, anarchists. And so it's a form of, again, it's another form of gatekeeping. It's another form of reductionism, and it's yet again another illustration of how sectarian the left can be at times, and how there's a lot of emphasis in the left to be extremely like orthodox and follow these mandated from upon high theories.
Oh yeah, by the way, we have a Marxist-Leninist on the chat, and he said that it was socialist, not state capitalist, and stop spreading bourgeois propaganda.
That's funny.
And the Soviet Union was good until Stalin died.
That's funny. That's really funny.
Sounds painful,
Like,
but
do
okay.
you like, do you people even realize what socialism is? Socialism means the workers control the means of production. In the Soviet Union, that was not the case. On paper, they did, but in reality, the Vanguard Party can suppress working class dissent. That workers were virtual slaves in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany and such. Like pretty much every quote unquote political socialist country has been the precise opposite of socialism in practice. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were out and out anti-socialist countries in practice.
Yeah. And then with Stalin himself was much worse than most other Marxist-Leninists when it comes to the front of environmental devastation, and that because of their obsession with ideological purity, the Stalinist official position on the environment was one of Lamarckian kind of biology, and that they rejected a lot of or maybe I don't, okay, maybe I misstated, but they rejected basically genetic inheritance in favor of kind of environmental inheritance of traits for species, and that led to widespread devastation of the Russian landscape, and it was the officially mandated only acceptable view for biology and ecology that they allowed for like their medical program, their environmental program, and a lot of their different academic programs, continuing on until, like, if I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure like into the late 50s, and like even possibly even later than that. So Stalin was no friend of the Green Movement, and anything other than that is frankly pretty anti-historical, or pretty ahistorical at least. Not to mention the fact that like the black and green farmers' armies during the Russian Revolution were staunch opponents of the Bolsheviks. So I'm not too interested in the bureaucratic authoritarian vanguard coming in and, you know, their mass industrialism. I mean, the idea that industrialism is an explicitly capitalistic enterprise is just not true in any way, shape, or form.
Someone put industrialization equals ecocide.
It's
In a
true.
nutshell.
At least mass industrialization. I mean, I think we should advocate more for local production rather than expansive industry, which has to distribute itself a lot of like at extreme distances to reach insulated, non-sustainable bourgeois communities, so that they can fulfill some kind of Western idea of quality of life. It's very ridiculous.
Also, Comrade Chiney also said that workers had ownership in the Soviet Union. They had co-ops and shit was great. So just because there were a few co-ops, that means the Soviet Union was somehow socialist.
All right, well,
There are a few co-ops in America, so America must be a socialist country by your logic. And then Chaya Bats Tazu.
Huh?
Chaya Botsby.
Yeah, he said, I don't get why Jason Unruh can praise Stalin while calling himself a third worldist, as Stalin was no friend of indigenous people or the environment.
Oh, okay, yeah. All right, so yeah, sorry, it was Lysenkoism, not Lamarckianism. Lamarckianism was a different biological outlook, but that's what I was talking about, was Lysenkoism.
Also, and then Comrade Chinese said Black Army and Machna were kulak bandits who hated socialism.
All right.
Sounds like I should ban this tanky.
No, don't ban the tanky. If anything, ban the atheists from the beginning.
No, I'll just let the tanky shit post. Anyways, yeah, like Jason Unruh claims to be a third worldist, yet he advocates for actually hurt third world people, which is ironic. That also weird that very few anarchists pointed that out.
Right.
I mean, we even have like anarchist friends who were like syndicalists, and a lot of them are pro-industrialists and thinks technology will just magically fix everything like a magic wand and have no consequences that are negative whatsoever ever.
Yeah, as if there is like some way to predict the future of technological development and like foresee all of its not just environmental and technological consequences, but its sociocultural ones. Oh, jeez.
The economy of the U.S. is always dominated by co-ops, and there were worker councils that sent representatives for the federal government. Oh God. Oh God.
Well, we don't have to. We can just stay on topic instead. We don't really have to get into a discussion of was the USSR leftist or not.
Yeah. I'm noticing that Jason Unruh very rarely talks about environmental issues.
Leftists rarely do. I mean, with the exception of leftists that make it an explicit part of their ideology, leftists don't really like to confront the realities of ecological devastation because it's far more complicated and it's far more immediate than the consequences of capitalism. Which isn't to say that, you know, the class struggle is beneath the environmental struggle. I think that they're fundamentally overlapped with one another, as well as racial struggle, as well as many other many other conflicts of oppression that we have to deal with from a leftist perspective, or just from any that mustn't necessarily be part of our politics.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing how a lot of leftists don't really like to talk about environmental issues. I mean, there's a lot of eco-socialists, but often eco-socialists and the regular socialists and the Marxists don't get along.
Yeah. Well, you'll have something akin along the lines of what they have in Europe, where you have an ongoing conflict between kind of the socio-ecologists and the green anti-capitalists and green socialists versus the traditional like revolutionary socialist and communist parties, where a lot of the time you'll have communist and revolutionary socialist parties calling green conflicts like revisionist or bourgeois or ridiculous shit like that, as if the environmental struggle is not a working class struggle. It's ridiculous. Of course the environmental struggle is a working class struggle, especially given the fact that like the rural working class, while living in a separate or like undergoing a different form of oppression than the urban industrial working class, is still fundamentally the proletariat. So it's, if anything, I find that far more, you know, I guess offensive would be the word to use, though that's not really the word I would use, than, you know, claims of revisionism or anything like that. And I don't really care. Like, I'm not interested in towing the party line from the First International, honestly.
Yeah, like honestly, brown socialists, you just fuck off.
Yeah.
There goes half my audience. Just kidding. Anyways, there's also overlap with the whole idea that, oh, there's no other issues except working class struggle, man. Gender issues don't exist. It's just class. It will just magically disappear when someone wakes up in a non-capitalist society, even though they hold sexist beliefs of their whole lives.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, this is clearly ridiculous because capitalism basically creates issues that very much intersect with gender issues, racial issues, like pretty much every form of inequality under the sun. So to say that that everything is just a matter of class is reductionist as hell.
Yeah.
It's all one struggle to total liberation. Workers, people of color, women, it's all struggle against the hierarchy, against oppression, against modernism, against the Enlightenment, against reactionaryism.
Well, I mean, like, I'm not opposed to Enlightenment values, but the excessive reliance on on technology and for everything. I mean, again, I'm not opposed to technology as as a part of everyday life, but obviously, but excuse me, technology, but like, I mean, the idea that technology can fix everything and the essentialism um, and scientific positivism that grew out of the Enlightenment, I am very much opposed to.
So what would the difference be if we did try to struggle for IDPOL under capitalism and then achieve socialism, or struggle for socialism and then taking care of IDPOL?
It's a question of why do we have to have, like, why does it have to be that sequential? Why can't we be simultaneously struggling for these struggles at the same time? I don't see why it has to be this one and then this one and then this one, because then you're creating a hierarchy of oppressions, saying this oppression is more pertinent than this oppression, which is more pertinent than this oppression. Well, I'll be the first to say that I'm not in favor of like a liberal conception of social justice, like you know, minority, you know, I guess, access to parliamentary politics. While it's essential to them being more involved in the current system, isn't as revolutionary as creating an autonomous infrastructure for every marginalized identity. So while I would say that all of us are in support of like suffrage rights and legal rights for marginalized groups, it's nowhere near the end of the line. So it's like a large portion of the queer community is very frustrated when its more liberal elements kind of threw their hands up and said, oh, now we've achieved marriage equality, there are no further struggles, even though that was fundamentally a struggle of more upper class white members of the queer community than it was for the majority of the queer community, where their struggle was the fact that they're overwhelmingly homeless, overwhelmingly trapped into like economic, like severe poverty, overwhelmingly have a much higher chance to get sexually transmitted diseases, have far like more or like far worse conditions of mental health. So, I mean, that's kind of my answer to that question, at least. I'm curious what your guys' answer is, but I don't imagine that it would be too different.
I would just go with your answer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely, though. I mean, a lot of. A lot. Even Marxism. I'm gonna get a lot of shit for this, but Marxism has a lot of essentialist tendencies. I mean, Marx, and also Marx did mention environmental stuff a few times, but his environmentalism doesn't even go that far.
Environmentalism is usually kind of given lip service, I've noticed, amongst leftists and in a lot of left-wing economic theories. And the unfortunate aspect is that a lot of the people that focus exclusively on ecology kind of fall into a kind of essentialist and natural rights trap when it comes to ecology. So I'm not really interested in either one of those conclusions. I don't think either one of them is sufficient. I don't want to fall into a natural rights, like very essentialist worldview, nor do I want to fall into a apathetic, technophilic, like utopian idea of environmental progress either. I think we have to realistically and locally address the problems of environmental devastation, and
Me too.
cultural and political causes.
I know there used to be a phrase that all politics is local, and it's not so much these days because nowadays local politics, all they talk about most of the time is national issues. But we have to bring back the localness of politics back to our communities. We're going to have to fight those corporations and establish alternatives. We need to fight a culture of resistance.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And a culture of resistance isn't just like, oh, just buy this vegan stuff. I mean, like, I do the same thing. I buy vegan stuff too, but that's not sufficient, and that doesn't mean that you're gonna save animals in total. I mean, there's a lot of shady ass shit that capitalists hide. It's very. The point is the struggle is connected. The struggle needs to be fought in a holistic and local level, and not have like any party bureaucrats or parties or labor unions or platform organizations or anything like that control what we do, but rather we run our own destiny. We choose. We should, as a working class and poor people and also marginalized people of all stripes, should choose our destiny. Do not let the vanguardists or the platformists or the Leninists or the syndicalists determine it.
Also, you gotta moderate these comments, dude. I don't know where all these like brigades of reactionaries are coming from, but it's getting pretty bad.
Oh my god, oh my god.
Yeah, you don't have to say it, just yeah, you should probably just take care of that.
Yeah, probably just could put them in timeout.
I wonder where they came from.
Mr. Dapperton.
Oh yeah, well, I wasn't gonna say it. Anyways, yeah. So, yeah, I'm in total agreement with you on all of those statements. So, Bobby, was there anything else that you wanted to talk about as it pertains to environmental issues?
Huh?
Was it anything that you wanted to talk about as it pertains to environmental issues?
Yeah, the, yeah, like the environment, yeah, like the environment, tends to be, like people tend to dismiss environmental issues as 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 a political thing, but they're really not. They're they're issues that apply to all of us, and so it doesn't matter whether you're a liberal or a conservative or a socialist or a social democrat or a
tanky
or an anarchist like us, because no matter what your political or religious or philosophical views may be, this shit matters to your life. Your very existence is threatened by these environmental catastrophes. And so while you may not want to hear about them, they aren't necessary for discussion.
Yeah, they really are. If anything, it's a very, 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 very visual and material way to see the outcome of certain economic systems. It's a very real way. It's a way that's tangible to people. All they have to do is go outside. All they have to do is notice the weather patterns and notice like the ecological climate and notice what's going on with species diversity, or whether it be like various kinds of migrations or irregular weather patterns, rising sea levels, you know, having flammable water come out of your faucet. It's it's it wakes people up real fast. I mean, you see that with what happened in Southern California last year. It was either last year or a couple of years ago, where you were having a gas leak, like an invisible gas leak that was threatening to poison an entire town. You know, not to mention the water crises that were taking place all over rural and poor parts of the United States. You know, so um, environmental disaster quickly wakes people up, very quickly wakes people up. And I mean, you know, it's bad when even the federal government is putting military funds towards precautionary measures due to climate change. You know,
Right.
and people aren't really receptive to messages that they find to be particularly alarming because they'll find it sensationalistic, or they'll think, oh, well, it couldn't possibly be that bad. And that's a very, you know, moderate, centrist, and detached, individualistic, and atomized way to view the world, where if the problem is not directly affecting me, therefore it doesn't exist. But then, you know, it's kind of the first they came for them and then they came for me analogy. As soon as these problems affect you, all of a sudden it becomes, you know, of concern to you now that it's, you know, now that it's threatening to harm your ass. So I think we ought to be more socially conscious than that. We have to be, you know, reasonable enough to be aware and sensitive enough the um, to the struggles of others to realize that these struggles aren't just of one or two individual groups, but it's a fundamental systematic problem. And we're not going to fix it by recycling glass bottles. We're not going to fix it by blaming people that they bought this product or they bought that product. And we're not going to fix it by taxing people who litter. We'll fix it once gigantic industries stop dumping all of their waste into rivers, when we finally eradicate the almost constant threat of like never-ending oil spills, whether it be a pipeline spill or an offshore spill, or the effect that airplanes have on the environment, or the effect that mass farming has on like methane and how that affects the environment, or the effect that like diesel-powered cars and vehicles have on the environment, and a fossil fuel like apparatus that continues the ever-churning drums of war for like neoliberal and neo-colonial like free market mercenary uh, wars over resources that are never going to end, you know? So we need to get people to realize that they have to listen to what the scientists have to say about these issues. They have to listen to the people that are bringing this up, because they're not just overreacting. I don't think anybody wants this to be the case. It would be much easier for everybody in the world if we had less struggles to worry about and not more struggles to worry about, you know? So um, yeah, sorry about that kind of little rant there.
Oh no, it's great. I really like the rants. And yeah, it's getting so bad that, well, mass intensive agriculture tends to last 400, 500 years. in a given civilization before it utterly collapsed. And that's just about how much years we have been, at least in the West, been like modern. So,
Yeah.
that means, yeah, we're basically dealing with a potential human extinction scenario, and we're gonna bring like huge portions of the life with us. I mean,
Yeah.
it really, I mean, people don't realize the extent of it because they've been numbed by like the climate change doesn't exist bullshit that even my mom believes, which is horrible. But ultimately, though, we are in this together, and let's hold those people who are doing it accountable, and let's stop those corporations from dumping toxic waste and cutting down all our trees and poisoning our water, and finally fight back and have this revolution.
Mhm.
Viva la revolution! This is the vegan anarchist, no meat, no milk, no masters.
This has been Bobby, aka Ashby, Anarchist, Liberty, Equality, Fraternity. Goodbye.
All right, and I'm Pedro. See you later.
Freedom for all, freedom for none. Free the earth, free your mind, free yourself.